This is probably the best known face in all of psychology. There is probably no individual in the history of our discipline that is more recognizable than Sigmund Freud. The only face probably in all of science that is more recognizable than Sigmund Freud's is that of Albert Einstein. And the only person about whom more has been written, his ideas, his life, than Sigmund Freud might possibly be Charles Darwin. That's the kind of company that Freud has kept over the years in terms of the intellectual history of the West. We almost literally swim in a sea of Freudian ideas. It is try to imagine any other theory whose concepts have so completely entered our own vocabulary as those of Freud. We talk about id and ego, and whoops, I should mention that he's also made the cover of just about every major news magazine, beginning in 1924, which is just 15 years before he died, the year of his death, and then several times since, not just Time, but Newsweek as well. I wanted to show you a couple of these because my favorite one is right back. Whoops, where is it? Yeah, right here. Freud is not dead. 1993, right? And I could have gone on. New Yorker, Humanities Magazine, there are dozens of them. There is few individuals who have been as ubiquitous in Western culture as Sigmund Freud. And as I said, I can think of no individual whose theoretical language has entered our vocabulary as completely as Freud's. Virtually every single word, every single concept that you can imagine having to do with Freud's theory is part of our everyday vocabulary. Ego and id and superego and libido and repression and denial and penis envy and castration anxiety and projection and reaction formation and rationalization and anal personality, and on it goes. I received today an email from the Chronicle of Higher Education. It's a daily email indicating stories that they are carrying in their magazine. And one of the blogs was entitled, "A University Designed by Demons from the Id." You simply cannot escape Freud at all. He is absolutely everywhere. And so ubiquitous have his ideas become that they are part of the fabric of virtually every product of Western culture you can imagine. It is hard to imagine, well, there are dozens and dozens and even hundreds of books, novels, television programs, movies, whose plots hinge on an understanding of Freudian mechanisms. If we go back, for example, to one of my very favorites, one of the very first movies I ever saw as a kid, gave me nightmares for a week, Alfred Hitchcock's classic Psycho. The character of Norman Bates in that movie is absolutely unfathomable unless you understand Freud's notion of Oedipus and identification with parents. It makes no sense otherwise. To move more recently, many of you might have seen Kevin Costner's movie, A Field of Dreams. Many people think it's a baseball movie. No, it's a movie about Freud and Oedipus. The whole thing hinges on Costner's relationship with his now dead father and his troubled Oedipal resolution. The entire story is based on that. If we move forward still farther, HBO's drama, The Sopranos, Tony Soprano's life and behavior can only be understood in the context of his Oedipal relationship with his mother, which takes up much of the first season of that series, and its exploration with his therapist. The same can be said, though perhaps less dramatically, yes, for the Harper brothers and their relationship with their mother. So everywhere you look, you find echoes of or references to Freud. I often like to say that it's almost impossible to understand Western culture over the last 100 years unless you understand the basic ideas that Freud put forward. Well, the thing is that while, and you find it elsewhere too, I was reading a recent review of the movie Inception, Leo DiCaprio and so on, and what does it talk about? Freud's model of dream analysis. Freud has been used to analyze history, myth, religion, literature, art, virtually everything, even politics. When George W. Bush became president, of course he was the son of a former president, we got reviews and books and articles all talking about Bush and Oedipus. Many people attribute his invasion of Iraq to an unconscious conflict or attempt to to do better than his father did in the first Iraq War. So there's been lots of analysis on the basis of Freudian mechanisms. Now, while Freudian ideas have dominated clinical, or did dominate clinical and applied psychology from the 19-teens right until the 1950s or 60s. The same cannot be said for experimental, scientific, academic psychology. And that's largely because of the 2 or 3 theoretical viewpoints that came to dominate psychology during that period. And I just want to briefly review them. Most of you will know about this. And the tenets of these particular theoretical perspectives seemed to be, at least, and are still seen by many to be, antithetical to Freud's ideas. The first, of course, the first big revolution was behaviorism. This is the major revolution in all of psychology. Remember that psychology began in the 1860s using introspection as a method. Look within yourself, and we will use that information to analyze the contents of consciousness. Right? And in 1913, John Watson published his manifesto, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, in which he argued that this was complete crap. And what we had to do was completely abandon introspection and focus on overt, publicly observable behavior, or we would never become a science. And so methodological behaviorism began then and dominates psychology today, as I suspect it always will. Along with methodological behaviorism came a few more philosophical views. What Watson said was, we have to completely ignore consciousness. We have to ignore, we can't go from behavior to an inference about internal mental states. In fact, Watson was a radical behaviorist and argued that those states did not exist. There was nothing but behavior. Well, if there's nothing but behavior and mental states don't exist, where does that leave Freud? Out in the cold, of course, in academic psychology. And we saw essentially from the point of view of behaviorism, personality is nothing more or less than consistent patterns of behavior. And psychopathology, mental disorders, are nothing but inconsistent, maladaptive patterns of behavior. We need not go beyond the surface observable behaviors to understand any of this whatsoever. The behaviorists also, of course, lean very heavily on learning mechanisms, our experiences in the environment, to explain these patterns of behavior, whether normal or abnormal. Again, Freud was left in the dust here. If we get into the 1950s, so behaviorism dominated, both theoretical and methodological behaviorism dominated psychology right into the 50s and early 60s, even beyond. And then along came you could call it a counter-revolution or another revolution, and that is cognitivism. The cognitivists were methodological behaviorists. They believed, as Watson had, that the only thing we could pay any attention to, the only thing that could be the foundation of a scientific psychology, was the study of overt, observable behavior. The difference was they started from that behavior and then went on to infer from it the existence and nature of internal contents and processes, something that the behaviorists, the strict behaviorists, would never have done. So for the cognitivists, personality is nothing more or less than consistent patterns of selecting, interpreting information, and thinking about it. We are what we think. And psychopathology is nothing more or less than consistent patterns of maladaptive thinking about the world around us. And so just as the behaviorists developed behavioral therapies, which involved using learning mechanisms, reinforcement, punishment, and so on, to alter behavior, maladaptive behavior, the cognitivists developed therapies that involved altering the way we think about the world around us. And that, of course, would assist with psychopathology. Because they're both methodological behaviorists, and in that sense some sort of philosophical soulmates, it's very often that these two approaches occur together. And one of the most common forms of therapy today is a combination of cognitive and behavioral therapies called CBT. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. I just want to mention in passing a third, I wouldn't call it a revolution exactly, a third very important and growing in importance theoretical approach to psychology, that of evolutionary psychology. It draws its roots from biology and animal behavior, the work of Lorenz and Tinbergen. And essentially it argues that in order to really understand behavior and mind and personality, what we really need to do is look at its adaptive function. What is it for? Has it evolved to help us do? How does it help us survive, live in our environment, and be reproductively successful? This particular approach, while it has been extremely productive in scientific psychology, has so far had very little impact in personality theory or clinical applied psychology because it focuses almost exclusively on the commonalities of human nature and experience. And it does not deal very well or clearly with individual differences, all of which are important in understanding personality and behavior and so on. And of course, it also it argues that much of what is important about human behavior, human nature, is not changeable in any easy way. And so therefore, it isn't readily applied to clinical psychology. Again, I'm going to come back to this in a bit. Okay, well, let's move back to Freud then. I'm going to treat Freud as a psychodynamic theorist, as we always do. But it's very important to understand that it's not as simple as that. Going back as far as the 1950s, it was possible to recast, rethink, reimagine Freud's theory as a learning theory, which Dollard and Miller did in 1950, talking about learning mechanisms, talking about approach and avoidance gradients. You could reimagine virtually all of Freud's constructs. In the 1960s and especially 70s and beyond, cognitivists looked at Freud and saw a cognitive theorist. Freud was talking about the way we think, even if unconsciously. And so we have a number of individuals recasting Freud as a cognitive theory, especially Hans Ardeli and his colleagues. So while we think of Freud as a psychodynamic theorist, and I'm going to talk about him that way, his ideas are much more flexible than that, much more adaptable than that. And I may mention that again as we move along. Okay, so what I really want to talk about is what did Freud say and what has happened to those ideas? Now, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of Freudian ideas, so we can't possibly, in the time we have here, deal with all of them. So I've picked 3 or 4 or 5 of the big ones, what I think are the big ones, and we'll talk about those only. The first thing we have to understand, though, is that Freud's ideas were not Freud's ideas. Freud had almost no ideas of his own, remarkably. Virtually every single concept and construct that we associate with Freud was somebody else's. Id, ego, libido, superego, the unconscious, everything. He borrowed from somebody else. He saw them as good ideas and he put them together. His contribution was to see how you could take that variety of constructs and make from it a complete and coherent model of personality and psychopathology. So even though we'll talk about these as Freud's ideas, they aren't really. They are ideas that Freud adapted into his model. And what were they? Well, we'll start with the most basic one. His idea that essentially the goal of all human existence is to experience pleasure, so-called hedonism. This is an ancient idea. This goes back to the Greeks. Right? And we'll talk about the fate of that later. Then perhaps what is certainly, I think, one of the most controversial and most often discussed aspects of Freud's theory. How do we experience pleasure? There are only 2 forms of it, only 2 ways to get it. Sex, that was the dominant view of Freud right up until 1918. And then, after the Great War, he added aggression as a secondary, largely secondary model. Sex and aggression. And of course, this was the basis for most of the early criticism of Freud. He developed this idea in the context of Victorian morality. And even today, we're reluctant to talk about these things, and that's why he draws a crowd whenever you talk about Freud. He also argued, he was among the first, some would say the very first, to argue that childhood experiences in the ages from birth to 6 or 7 have a real significant and lasting impact on adult personality and behavior. This was not the idea before Freud. Before Freud, the notion was that children were just little big people who got bigger. They got bigger quantitatively. They just got larger. That's why even in England in the 1830s or 40s, you could send a 7-year-old child off to Australia to their death for stealing 2 feet of ribbon from a store. They were just little people, just the same as adults, and were held to the same standards. Freud said no. They are qualitatively different. He also, and this of course again was and remains one of the most controversial aspects of his theory, we typically think of behavior as becoming sexual only at puberty, and before that, children are little innocents who know nothing, feel nothing that we would call sexual. Freud said, no, no, no. beginning at birth. Children are sexual beings, and they take and experience and enjoy sexual pleasures. Well, you can imagine how that went over in Victorian Europe. It doesn't go over much better today here in North America. And then we get to another major foundation of Freud's thinking. He argued that virtually everything that is really significant about us, the things we need to know about us to understand who we are not available for conscious awareness. Right? We don't know who we are. We don't know what our conflicts are. We don't know what our motivations are. And so we need to do some digging. This is one stage beyond introspection. Introspection looks in at our conscious contents and describes them for others. Psychoanalysis asks us to look in and find somehow our unconscious content and analyzes them. And of course, that too was at the time very controversial. Okay, so let's talk about the fate of Freud's ideas. What has happened to them? Well, let's start with hedonism. The idea that all human behavior is ultimately motivated by the desire to maximize pleasure and minimize unpleasure, as Freud called it. Well, I mean, this is, as I said, a 3,000-year-old idea. And who's going to deny it? Right? It is still, I mean, it's not something that people talk about or do research on. It's a philosophical position, but it's still viable. You might say, yeah, but I do things I don't want to do. Well, sure you do, but the alternative would be worse, wouldn't it? That's the whole notion of minimizing unpleasure. You go to the dentist and have a root canal, but the alternative is to be in pain for months. So, yeah, it's two bad choices, but one is less unpleasurable than the other. Still a very common notion in many philosophies. Sexuality and aggression as primary motivations. Well, Freud certainly couldn't have got it more wrong here, could he? Right? Well, I mean, the amount of evidence for this, a lot of it anecdotal, admittedly, is astonishing. Try to find a book, a television program, a movie, anything virtually that doesn't either refer to, contain, or describe sex and aggression. Video games, we could go on and on. The internet, the largest use of the internet, so we are told, is pornography and erotica, right? As we always knew it would be, right? This is what's happening. I mean, it's just, now, the question really is not, are sex and aggression important motives? Everybody knows they are. The question really is, can we explain absolutely everything about human behavior in the terms of sex and aggression? Well, Freud certainly thought we could. We'll leave that as an open question, but the reality and importance of these drives is unquestionable. In fact, I mentioned evolutionary psychology, what is it they focus on? Sex and aggression, of course. Right? It is absolutely everywhere. This is what we censor movies and rate movies and television programs for. This is the basis of most criminal activity and the laws against it. I mean, it is absolutely everywhere. And so we certainly can argue that this is something that people still accept. Interestingly, Freud had hypothesized that sex and aggression were the sole sources of pleasure, funded, if you like, by the same energy, libido. There's an interesting paper published in 2008 which shows that aggression engages the very same dopamine-using reward structures in the brain that food and sex do. So maybe Freud had something after all. And indeed, most of our drives are controlled by the very same structure, the hypothalamus, that controls everything. So there certainly is some reason, even physiologically, to think that Freud might have had it right here. What about the impact of childhood experiences? Well, this is an easy one. Everybody accepts this now. The behaviorists accept it, the cognitivists accept it. Hardly anybody would deny that childhood experiences are important in shaping adult behavior. One of the major thrusts of analysis that came out directly out of psychoanalysis was attachment theory. Still a very, very useful and often used way of analyzing and understanding the relationship between a child's relationship with their parents and their subsequent relationships with others. Dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of books and papers on this. Very, very fruitful and stemming right out of psychoanalytic thinking. Well, childhood sexuality. This is a tough one, primarily because almost nobody wants to look at this. Almost nobody. The number of papers that have examined childhood sexual behavior is vanishingly small, mostly European. Right? Quite apart from our terror at what we might find, there are, we consider, ethical issues in asking children or asking parents about childhood sexual behavior. But what do the data show when we find data? Well, what the data suggests is that, boy, oh boy, there's an awful lot of sex going on below the age of 8 or 9. Right? Study in 1988, 40% of males reported their first sexual arousal before the age of 8. 1997, 50% of young adults report interactive sexual activities before the age of 6. 75% of mothers reported their children had engaged in sexual behaviors before the age of 6. And my favorite, this is the most complete one. This is a German study done in 1991. This was parent-reported sexual behavior between the ages of 2 and 6. Now, parent report, of course, is going to be an underestimate for the most part because children don't generally do their sexual activity in front of parents. But what did we find? 23% of males and 16% of females were reported by their parents to have engaged in masturbation between the ages of 2 and 6. An even larger percentage, 64% of males, 50% of females, were reported to have engaged in touching their genitals before the age of between 2 and 6. So there seems little doubt, though we probably want to turn our heads away from it, that Freud was right about sexual behavior in childhood. And as I said, the number of studies on this is relatively small because it's a very, very touchy topic. We don't want to believe this. I mean, the worst kind of crime we can imagine is sexual behavior engaged in with a child, isn't it? So even for children themselves to be engaging in it, self-pleasuring, is something that we find very difficult to get our heads around. Okay, the Oedipus complex. We finally got to it. This is probably the strongest, apart from the word sex itself, is probably the strongest associate with the word Freud that you can imagine. Oedipus was the heartland of Freudian theorizing, right? And it's, as I said, it's the base for understanding a whole lot of movie, TV, book plots, and so on. Now, the Oedipus complex, we're going to talk about it only in boys, although it occurs both in boys and girls, is probably the most misunderstood of all Freud's constructs. So I want to tell you the story of Oedipus twice. First, I want to tell you the story as we most understand it. Between the ages of 4 and 6, a young boy wants to have sex with his mother. He realizes that his father is an obstacle in the way to having sex with his mother, so he wants to kill his father. He fears, however, that his father will retaliate, big guy, will retaliate against him by cutting off his penis, which, Freud calls castration. And so now we have a dilemma. And how are we going to solve this? Well, the boy solves it by identifying with dad defensively, and identifying with mom is a way of possessing her, and taking on their characteristics forms the third and final structure of the psyche, the superego, which is our moral, ethical sense, which we get, therefore, from our parents. The boy continues throughout life to lust after his mother, and one expression of that is his desire to marry someone who resembles, in some way, his mother. How many of you would say that's your basic understanding of Freud's Oedipus complex? Yeah, that's the typical way it's done. And how many of you would say it sounds really wacky, described like this? Thank you very much, yes. It does to me, too. Now let's go on and talk about it the way Freud talked about it. Because that's not what I just told you. It's not exactly what Freud said. In fact, much of what we hear about the Oedipus complex isn't really Freud's theory. It is simply a restatement of very common, easily made observations about the way children behave. Let's take a look at it again. First of all, Freud did not say that the child wanted to have sex with his mother. This is a 4-year-old who's known nothing about sex. Right? What the child wants is to possess his primary caretaker's attention all to himself. Does that sound strange? No, we were all like that, weren't we? Right? Complete and total attention by the caretaker on the child, and that's what the child wants. Now, because every pleasure, of course, is a sexual pleasure, that's why we might then think, well, the child wants to have sex with mom. But no, not at all. So, and of course, mom doesn't devote her time exclusively to the boy. There are rivals for mom's affection and attention. We put dad in that place, but dad is not the only possible one. A sibling, younger child, right? Newborn baby who suddenly begins to take all the attention of mom. This is not good either. The boy wants to eliminate the rival. And of course, this is a very well-known problem in families where an infant is born with a 3 or 4-year-old child already in the house. There can be conflict. There can be problems. And it makes perfectly good sense, not just within the context of Freud, but just in terms of our own understanding of how childhood works, right? And so the boy wants to eliminate the rival. I mean, killing is one thing. I mean, the child knows that people who are dead generally go away and don't come back, even though they don't understand what death involves. And will leave in boy fears castration at the hands of his father. I'm not going to elaborate on that, though there's some evidence for it. And yes, the argument is that the boy identifies with dad, identifies with mom, and then takes on their characteristics to form their moral sense or superego. But there isn't a single model, with the possible exception of Piaget's, of moral development that doesn't accept this. The behaviorists agree that reward and punishment for moral behavior is where we get our morality. Freud says so. The cognitivists agree. Everybody agrees. This is not a theoretically contentious issue. It is simply a statement of our general belief that our morality is shaped by our experiences, especially our experiences in the family relationship. There's nothing very controversial about this. How many of you think this sounds wacky? Well, there you are, you see? I mean, so Freud was not as strange in what he believed and said as many people think. You can see these things going on. If you've got younger brothers or sisters, or you remember when you were young and had siblings, you will remember some of this stuff having happened, right? There are any number of anecdotal reports of little boys at the table saying, I'm gonna get rid of dad and marry you, mom, as soon as I grow up. It happens all the time. It's not theoretically contentious, or shouldn't be. Okay, so there's Oedipus. The boy continues to seek a mom replacement as his mate. Well, I mean, so we could call this sexual imprinting. Well, we know it happens in non-human species. This is one of the earliest demonstrations in animal behavior. Remember Lorenz and his little ducklings, right? Following him around because he was the first thing they saw? That's sexual imprinting. They wanted to mate with his boots and so on. Well, there's also evidence this occurs in human, not mating with boots, but I mean, there's also evidence that sexual imprinting occurs in humans. There are a number of studies that demonstrate, for example, that undergraduates can match at greater than chance levels an adopted girl's father with her spouse. Right? I don't have the data for boys, but I mean, there is evidence for this. So it isn't all that strange, and it makes sense in the larger context of evolutionary psychology as well, doesn't it? So again, Freud seems to be ahead of the curve here. Now, what about unconscious processes? Well, I mean, and again, in some ways, this is a completely non-controversial issue. We all know there's an unconscious. Most of the stuff we know is there right now, isn't it? Our memories, the things we know about psychology and mathematics and biology and chemistry, they're not in our conscious awareness right now. They couldn't be. There's too much of it. There has to be some place that we call the unconscious, or whatever you want to call it, where things reside when they're not part of working memory, as we would say in cognitive psychology. So that part of it certainly has got to be non-controversial. The question really is, how do we conceptualize this non-conscious part of the mind? And let me just throw out a few examples of the sorts of behavior that we really want to be able to explain in our conceptualization of unconscious processes. We'll begin where Freud began, with hypnotic phenomena. Freud, as you may know, tried to use hypnosis to get memories out of his patients early on. He was a terrible hypnotist. That's why the couch, incidentally, appeared in Freud's waiting room. His patients would lie there as he tried to induce a hypnotic state, usually unsuccessfully. Anyway, so he went off to France and he talked with two of the, what were then the world's best known hypnotists, Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris and Hippolyte Bernheim in Nancy. And they showed him phenomena which we're now very familiar with that suggested to him, oh my God, there's something really important and psychological going on here. The first of these things was hypnotic amnesia. Anybody who's watched Mike, what's his name? The hypnotist who comes I forget his name. It comes every year virtually during Welcome Week to do his shtick. And one of the things he can demonstrate is putting someone in a hypnotic trance and then doing various things and saying to them before they are brought out of the state, you will not remember anything that happened to you under hypnosis. Sure enough, they come out and they don't. Where does that stuff go? Where is it now? Right? Because it happened to them. And in fact, you can demonstrate that if you push it, really push it and insist, they will recall. Why did they have so much difficulty? Why was it unconscious? Well, there you are. That's a question. What about post-hypnotic suggestion? Where you do the same thing, you induce amnesia, right? But while they were in the hypnotic state, you say, when you are out of the state, and I say the word banana, for example, you will take off your shoes and socks. Out they come from the state, and they don't remember anything, and you say, well, would you like a drink? Are you hungry? How about an apple? How about a banana? Off come the shoes, off come the socks. Now you ask the individual, why did you do that? And a lot of the time they'll say, I have no idea. Sometimes, though, they'll make up a story. My feet were really hot and aching, and I thought I'd just take off my shoes and socks and feel better. Where did that story come from? The interesting thing about this to Freud was, here's evidence that we engage in behaviors for reasons we know nothing about. In fact, we may make up reasons that we perhaps believe in about why we engage in the behavior, despite the fact that observers know perfectly well it's not true. Where does that come from, if not from the unconscious? We see the same kind of phenomenon in split brain patients. These are individuals who've had their corpus callosum severed. The left brain doesn't talk to the right brain. It's a wonderful treatment for very severe epilepsy that crosses the hemispheres. But what it leaves is two parts of the brain that don't talk to each other, only one of which appears to be conscious, the left side. So what we can do here is we can present very briefly to the visual fields two different stimuli. So suppose we show a very racy, erotic picture to the right hemisphere, right, which can't speak. And we show an ordinary landscape to the left hemisphere, which can speak. What very often happens is, of course, the individual starts to blush and giggle and act as though they've been aroused. And then you ask them, what's going on? They say, I have no idea. Right? One part of their brain has elicited an emotional response. The other part knows nothing about it. Sometimes they, too, make up a story about why they're reacting as they do. And again, we know the story is false. They do not. Where is that coming from, if not from the unconscious? Blind sight. Individuals who've sustained damage to parts of the visual cortex. They have a blank spot in the part of their visual field. Nothing that appears there can be seen consciously. But if we ask them to guess what it is, using a multiple choice format, pick one of these four things that might be there. They'll protest, but I can't see anything. But they choose anyway. And they choose at above chance level, right? Significantly above chance. Some part of the mind knows what's there and has conveyed that information in some form to them. How do we understand that? Right? And then we have a whole raft of literature now. It's been growing for the last 20 years on the effects of subliminal stimuli. Subliminal stimuli are those that are presented so briefly or so dimly that they cannot be identified consciously. They can't be seen, really. The individual doesn't even know that anything has been presented. Now, one of the phenomena we see here is, what do I want to call this? There's a very well-known phenomenon, the mirror exposure effect. If you see something a large number of times, you rate it more positively than if you've seen it less frequently. It works for faces, it works for words, it works for dozens and dozens of things. This is one of the best established phenomena in all of social psychology. The curious thing is, the same thing happens if the individual is presented with these stimuli subliminally. So they never saw anything consciously, nothing. But the number of times you presented it to them is still related to their liking for this thing when you finally do present it to them, supraliminally. They have no idea what has happened. And their liking for the object is manipulated by the number of times it was not seen but presented. Right? And there's a whole raft of literature very much like that. We can demonstrate that when you present a negative word subliminally, it influences the ratings of almost anything that shows up afterwards. You present a smiley face and then show a person, and your rating of that person goes up compared with if you had been presented subliminally a frowning face. Dozens and dozens and dozens of studies. Cognitive psychologists now have largely admitted the existence of the unconscious. They don't call it that. They call it a bunch of other things, but nevertheless, that's what it is. The big debate now is what's going on there. Is it content only? Is it process only? Is it content and process? If it's process, what are the processes, and so on. We also get a lot of work on implicit attitudes, where we can demonstrate, I'm not going to go through the process here, that individuals have unconscious attitudes about things, especially things like race and religion and so on, which can be very different from their conscious attitudes about the very same attitude object. And there's an extensive literature in social psychology precisely on what this all means. What is the relationship between implicit unconscious attitudes and explicit ones, which relates best to behavior, and so on and so forth. But it's a clear recognition that these processes are there and happening and significant. And who knows what else we'll find as we keep looking. So this is definitely chalk one up for Freud. He was absolutely, it would appear, he was absolutely right on this, even though people, as I said, really don't like to use the word unconscious or subconscious, because I think it's Freudian. Now, I want to mention just one other thing, though I do so reluctantly, and that is evaluations of psychoanalytic or psychodynamic therapy. I do it because one of the very first targets of criticism of Freud was his therapy. It doesn't work. It's no good. It's crap. It's stupid. One of the best-known people to have said essentially that in a book-length version was Hans Eysenck, The Myth of Psychotherapy, and so on and so forth. And in truth, the other problem with it is that just because a therapy based on a theory works does not mean that the theory is true. And just because a therapy based on a theory doesn't work doesn't mean the theory is false. But with that understanding, let's take a look at the issue of whether psychodynamic therapy actually works or not. This has been fought over for about 30 or 40 years. The psychoanalysts themselves admit that they were lax in demonstrating the effectiveness, the efficacy of psychoanalysis. They didn't do as many studies as they should, partly because a lot of them weren't in academic psychology. They were private practitioners. But that's beginning to be rectified. A very recent paper, just a few months old, published by Jonathan Shedler in the American Psychologist, and I guess recently republished in a shorter version in the latest issue of Scientific American Mind, cites an enormous number of meta-analytic studies that have looked at the efficacy of psychotherapy, which I will use as a synonym for psychoanalytic therapy, because it essentially is. And he argues, and I think quite persuasively, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it is very effective indeed. All right? If you want to take that as an indication of the efficacy of the suitability of Freud's theory. I want to mention one study in particular because it really is fascinating. It goes back about 10 or 12 years, done by Ablon and Jones. I forget where they are now, but they were at Berkeley, I think, at the time. And essentially what they did was they had experts in two kinds of therapy, cognitive behavioral, CBT, and psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy, construct a prototype of each therapy using the psychotherapy process, QSET. Essentially what they did was they chose statements that they thought were most prototypical of what should happen in either cognitive behavioral therapy or psychodynamic psychoanalytic therapy. And so here's what, let me just show you what they did. Panels of experts developed prototypes of psychodynamic and cognitive blah, 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 using the blah, blah, blah. The prototypes were used to assess the extent to which treatments conform to the prototypes, and was there any relationship between treatment efficacy and the extent to which these treatments corresponded to the prototypes. Let's look quickly at the prototypes. I'll just put them up. Here are the 10 top statements that were endorsed by experts in psychoanalysis or psychotherapy as typical and prototypical of psychoanalysis. The patient's dreams or fantasies are discussed. The therapist is neutral. The therapist points out the patient's use of defenses. The therapist draws connections between the therapeutic relationship and other relationships. That's the transference. Therapist is sensitive to the patient's feelings, interprets what are unconscious wishes, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So that's the 10 top statements that characterize, so the experts said, psychodynamic therapy. What about cognitive behavioral therapy? Let's put that up. There's not a single point of overlap in it. Discussion of tasks and activities for the patient. Discussion centers on cognitive themes, ideas, beliefs. The treatment goals are discussed. The therapist actively exerts control over the interaction, structuring the sessions, introducing new topics, and so on and so on and so forth. The therapist gives explicit advice and guidelines, et cetera, et cetera. So very different models of what's going on in therapy. Now, what they did was they They took 3 archived sets of therapeutic protocols, that is, complete transcripts of therapies. And they looked at the experts rate the extent to which each transcript fit the prototype of either psychodynamic or cognitive behavioral therapy. So they were looking at these 3 sets of transcripts. Psychodynamic therapy for a variety of different disorders, psychodynamic therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, and cognitive behavioral therapy. This was for depression. Okay? So here, what we're seeing here is the correlation in each of these data sets between the prototype of psychodynamic or cognitive behavioral therapy and what actually happened. What we see here is that in the psychodynamic therapy, in fact, it was the case that what actually happened in the session was more highly correlated with the prototype for psychodynamic therapy, but it was also reasonably correlated with the prototype for cognitive therapy. If we take a look at the psychodynamic therapy for PTSD, there was essentially no difference. What actually went on in therapy was equally likely to be described by the psychodynamic prototype or the CBT prototype. But the purists here were the CBT folks, right? And that CBT for depression is a very well-established procedure. Essentially, there was no correlation, less than 0 actually, between what went on in this set of sessions and the psychodynamic prototype, but there was a whoppingly big correlation between what went on in these sessions and the CBT prototype. And this is CBT therapy, so this is no surprise. So we see some CBT sneaking into the psychodynamic sessions, nothing, purity, in these CBT sessions. So now the question is, how effective are they? What they did here was they looked at the relationship between how close you were to the prototype and how much better the patient got. Is it better in terms of success of therapy to be close to the psychodynamic prototype? Or is it better to be close to the CBT therapy? Let's take a look at the psychodynamic therapy sample. We're just going to look at 2 of them. And let's take a look. We'll just put this up. All right, so here are the correlations between prototype and success, if you like, or improvement. Essentially what it shows is that there's a very high correlation between how closely you followed the psychodynamic protocol and how much better your patient got in this sample. So what about, these things are all measures of improvement. Target complaint scale filled out either by the patient, the therapist, another independent evaluator, and so on. Let's take a look at the relationship between how closely the transcripts followed the CBT model and improvement. Nothing, except for the brief psychiatric rating scale as estimated by the therapist. So essentially, there's a very high correlation between all measures, essentially, of following the psychodynamic protocol and patient improvement. There's almost no relationship between following the cognitive behavioral prototype and improvement. Now, this is in a psychodynamic therapy, right? Let's take a look at it in the cognitive behavioral therapy, where they're presumably following this. And again, they're using different measures of improvement. The Beck, that should be the Beck, not the DEC. Beck Depression Inventory, blah, 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 blah. You can take a look at this. So let's look at how well the cognitive people did. Well, now we're getting some better correlations, especially for the automatic thoughts questionnaire with respect to feelings. There's a higher correlation between, following the CBT protocol and improvement on that measure. Let's take a look at now the psychodynamic. They're higher. Essentially, what these data show is that even in cognitive behavioral therapy, the probability, the likelihood, the association with improvement is more closely related to whether you follow those psychodynamic protocols than whether you followed CBT. Here's their summary. Whoops. Yes. The psychodynamic prototype constructed by experts was consistently, significantly correlated with positive outcome in both psychodynamic and cognitive behavioral therapy. The cognitive behavioral prototype was not consistently, significantly correlated with positive outcome in either type of therapy. Right? So that's pretty impressive. Now, I don't want, as I said, I don't want to take this as absolute proof positive that psychodynamic therapy is better. This was actually a brief form of psychodynamic therapy in most cases. only that there is good evidence that a therapy based on Freud's model works, and works well. In Shedler's paper, he goes on to talk about effect sizes in meta-analysis that suggest that the effectiveness of psychotherapy is actually better, higher, in terms of effect sizes than medication for many disorders. Right? So it works. Now, we don't know why it works. Is it because of the Freudian theory? We don't know. But there it is. Now, so where are we with Freud? Well, I would argue that not only is Freud dead, he's never died. I mean, the man is dead. He's been dead for 70 years. The ideas are still living on. I mean, not only have they been borrowed by many other therapists, they've taken their place in some cases as received wisdom in psychology, no longer recognized or identified as Freudian. And I don't think we'll ever abandon Freud's ideas until we come up with a theory that does a better job of explaining and predicting behavior and personality than Freud's does. And since no theory does that very well, including Freud's, I think it's going to be a very long time, if ever, before these ideas disappear. So, Freud lives on, I think, and I hope he always will, because this is a really fascinating way to look at people. Not that it's the only way or the best way. There is no one way to best understand people and personality. We have to look at it from a number of different perspectives. Freud's is one of them, and I think one of the most interesting and richest ones. Thank you very much, everybody.